This show is a part of the FM Podcast Network. Visit us at fmpods.com.
Welcome to Watching the Covers Flow, the podcast about covers of and by Bob Dylan. I'm your host, Ray Padgett. I write the newsletter Flagging Down the Double E's, all about Dylan in concert, and wrote the book Pledging My Time, Conversations with Bob Dylan Band Members. I also run the cover songs site Cover Me, so this podcast unites my two passions, covers and Bob Dylan music, and every episode will be either covers of Bob Dylan songs or covers of other songs by Bob Dylan. Each episode will have a topic or theme, and of course a whole lot of music, as well as some info from me about each song. We will also publish show playlists on most popular streaming services, so if you want to listen to the full songs, you can look in the show notes to find the playlists. This show is part of the FM Podcast Network. Some shows will be free, but FM Plus subscribers will get extended and bonus episodes. If you sign up, you get all the extras from every show on the network, which includes Pod Dylan, Dylan FM, The Dylan Taunts, and others. Sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or at fmpods.com. Welcome to Watching the Covers Flow. Today we're continuing our series of the second half of the 1980s in Bob Dylan, the years that some consider the worst of his career. Today's theme looks at covers of Bob Dylan that were in fact released during those years. The years, in this case, 1985, 1986, 87, and 88. We're looking for great covers released then, and furthermore, I'm looking for covers that sound like the 80s. Obviously, any year you pick, there are a ton of good Dylan covers that come out. I mean, how many good Dylan covers in a year? 50, 100? So I wanted to further narrow it down. So I picked 4 per year from 85 through 88, looking not just for how good they are, but also how 80s they are. You know, drum machines, synths, hip-hop in a few cases. These are covers that not just happened to come out in the 80s, but had to come out in the 80s. Let's dive in. We start with 4 covers released in 1985, and the first of which is by a band that actually a few years later in 1990 would tour with Bob Dylan, opening for him. That band is Wire Train. They are a alt-rock group from San Francisco, though alt-rock maybe makes them sound a little edgier than they are on this song. The clear comparison here is U2, who in fact themselves would cover Bob Dylan during the period we're talking about. On Rattle and Hum in 88, U2 covered All Along the Watchtower. But I don't think that one's all that good, frankly, and I really like this one. This is Wire Train from their 1985 album, Between Two Worlds, doing With God on Our Side.
My name, it means nothing. My age, it means less. The country I come from is called the Midwest. I was raised and brought up.
Next up from 1985 is Mitch Ryder. And if you know that name, you might be thinking to yourself, Mitch Ryder, he's not an 80s guy, he's a 60s guy. He's the guy who did Devil with a Blue Dress On. If you're a Bruce Springsteen fan, he's the guy who first did the Detroit medley that Bruce has performed in concert for years. Well, like a lot of guys from the 60s, including, by the way, Bob Dylan, Mitch Ryder was clearly at a bit of a loss in the 80s, trying to stay relevant. That's the only way I can explain this version of Like a Rolling Stone, in which he brings in hip-hop and funk, he brings in synths and drum machines, really all sorts of things that an old rhythm and blues singer from Detroit probably has no business using. Looking this up, I discovered that this was produced by none other than Don Was, who would go on to produce Under the Red Sky in 1990. Kind of makes you wonder if Bob Dylan had heard this version of Like a Rolling Stone, he produced for Mitch Ryder if Bob Dylan would have given him the keys to the studio like he did. This is one of those that I think it's probably mostly good in sort of a novelty way. I don't know that I would go to the wall defending its artistic merits, but I find it extremely fun, and you can't deny it is very 80s. Just a quick reminder, there is a Watching the Covers Flow playlist with full versions of all or most of these songs, available on most major streaming services. Find the link in the show notes. Next up, we've got one of my favorite bands, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. The song they're doing is Wanted Man, so in a way it's a cover of a cover, because this was the song that Bob Dylan wrote for Johnny Cash, and Cash put it on his At San Quentin album. When Cave recorded this dark and menacing cover for his second album with the Bad Seeds called The Firstborn is Dead, he actually got permission from both Cash and Dylan to change the lyrics and add a bunch of his own. A bunch of very Nick Cave-esque lyrics, my favorite of which is a new verse. If the devil comes collectin' 'cause he doesn't know I'm a wanted man, he better wear a 6-gun on his hip and hold another in his hand.
Arizona, wanted man in a Galveston. Wanted man in El Dorado. This wanted man's in great demand. If you're here, catch me sleeping. Just see the price flash above my head. Take a look again, my friend. That's a gun pointed at your head. Wanted man by Lucy Watson. Wanted man by Jesse Brown. Wanted man by Johnson, wanted man in our next town, wanted man by the Border Sisters, wanted man by Kate Callahan. Hey honey, don't you tell me you don't want me, 'cause I'm a wanted man. A wanted man who lost his will to live, a haunted man who won't live.
Our final cover of 1985 comes from a group called the Rave-Ups, and when I looked them up on Wikipedia to see who they were, the first thing it said is that their claim to fame is appearing in the 1986 John Hughes movie Pretty in Pink, and I don't know how much more 80s cred you need than being in Pretty in Pink. They were not just on the soundtrack, they were actually in the movie, playing in a concert scene. They did not unfortunately do this song, but it is actually from the same album as the song they did do, their 1985 debut album recorded while they were all working in the mailroom at A&M Records and borrowing the label's studio time on off hours. This is their version of You Ain't Going Nowhere. When I was whittling down the many Dylan covers to come out in the late 80s to pick which 16 I would play on this episode, I ranked them according to two scales. The first was how good they are, obviously. The second was how 80s it is, and this next track is the only of all of these that I gave a 10 out of 10 on the how 80s scale. The group is called Wack Attack. I mean, right there, Wack Attack. What other decade could that have happened in? They only released a couple singles as far as I can tell. They were a kind of a soul hip-hop group from Philadelphia. They went full Run-DMC on this version of Subterranean Homesick Blues. It is absolutely wild. It sounds absolutely like, 80s sort of early hip-hop hitting its popularity. Subterranean Blues, sometimes it's called the first rap song, so it's a pretty good choice to do this with. It's hard to not smile or potentially laugh while hearing this, though honestly, in addition to being absurdly 80s, I actually think it's pretty good. So here is Wack Attack doing Subterranean Homesick Blues.
Look out, kid! I said, look out, kid! Look out, kid! I said, look out, kid, kid,
Now we'll shift gears into something a little more broadly palatable. It's still plenty 80s, but maybe not just that much of an extreme. This is the long-running Tucson group Giant Sand. Perhaps of interest to the sort of people listening to this is the group where Winston Watson, Dylan's 90s drummer, honed his chops. When I interviewed Winston for my book, he actually compared Dylan to Giant Sand. I just looked up the quote. Howie Gelb is the long-running leader of Giant Sand, and Winston told me, quote, I had initially played with Howie in the 80s, which kind of prepared me for the unpredictability of Dylan in the 90s. The two of them, they were parallel. They're very prolific, they're very idiosyncratic, and they're really special. They're the kind of people that come around every once in a while, and you take note. This version of All Along the Watchtower by Giant Sand, unfortunately, I looked it up. Winston is not the drummer on. He wasn't with them right at this moment, I guess. But it's still really good. So here's Giant Sand doing their version of Watchtower.
Confusion here. Don't get no relief. Businessmen, they drink my wine. Plowmen dig my earth. None of you along the line. No one in this world.
I always find it refreshing to hear any version of Watchtower that does not devolve into a Jimi Hendrix wannabe solo fest. And I should add, the album that came out on in 1986 was called Ballad of a Thin Line Man. So there you go, another Dylan nod right there. This next artist is more associated with the 70s than the 80s. His name is Luther Ingram. In 1972, he had a #1 R&B hit with If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right. And a slight Dylan connection, he also co-authored the classic Respect Yourself, which was a huge hit for Mavis Staples and the Staples Singers. But of course, this cover comes from the 1980s, 1986. It has Gotta Serve Somebody. And honestly, overall, it could come from the 70s in terms of his vocals, in terms of the backing vocals, in terms of most of the instrumentation. The one extremely 80s touch is they went all in on one of those 80s drum machines, which makes it unmistakably from this era. So here's Luther Ingram with Gotta Serve Somebody.
You might be an ambassador to England or France. You might like to gamble you might like to dance. You may be the heavyweight champion of the world. You might be a young socialite with a long string of pearls, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody.
Serve somebody.
You may be a rock and roll addict, prancing on stage.
Just a quick reminder, there is a Watching the Covers Flow playlist with full versions of all or most of these songs, available on most major streaming services. Find the link in the show notes. Our final cover from 1986 comes from the Boston punk band Nervous Eaters. They did a version of The Times They Are A-Changin' on their 12-inch Hot Steel and Acid. Just to make the song extra punk, I guess, they changed one subtle lyric. The original is, of course, "For he that gets hurt will be he who is stalled." Nervous Eaters' version, just to make it angrier and punkier, goes, "For he that gets killed will be he who is stalled."
Gather round people wherever you roll. Admit the waters around you have grown. Accept that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If time to you is worth saving, then you better stop sweating or you sink like a stone. 'Cause the times they are a-changin'. Now writers and critics who prophesy with your pen.
We're halfway through here as we enter 1987, and we're going to kick it off with maybe the best known cover on this entire list, and maybe the best cover on this entire list. This is Siouxsie and the Banshees doing This Wheel's on Fire. Siouxsie didn't even know this was a Bob Dylan song when they decided to cover it for their covers album Through the Looking Glass. That's all we have time for in this public episode, but to hear the extended edition of this show and all the other shows on the FM Podcast Network, become an FM Plus subscriber. You can sign up in Apple Podcasts or at fmpods.com.
If your memory serves you well, when we're gonna meet again and work.
Did you enjoy this show? Then please rate this podcast and leave a review. It really helps. And take a moment to follow this podcast so you don't miss upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening.